As we set aside our day and our surroundings and draw our attention inward, I invite you to take another deep, calm belly breath. God, in its all pervasive presence of peace and love, is all there is. God is the silence out of which everything comes. God is the source of truth, conscious intelligence, and limitless possibilities that created this amazing universe and beautiful earth. God is the divine spirit that is life itself. I am as God is. I am one with this perfect life and source of love, as is each one of us here tonight. I, Freya, bless this coming together in spirit for this midweek Zoom oasis during this time affecting the health and well-being of the world and our own lives. I move my attention from my head to my heart and feel touched by the expansive love within. I bless each one of us here and call forth from our essence our voice of spirit. I bless this time we have this evening when we can both rest in stillness and learn about, be aware of, look deeply into, and share about things that are important and meaningful issues related to our times of change and transition. I bless this oasis as an opportunity to call forth the creative presence in each one of us and to drink from the fountain of life to feel renewed and inspired. And we all can say, and so it is.
And so it is. Thank you, Freya. So our speaker tonight is Alena Hutchinson. So Alena, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Welcome, everyone. If I started this talk by saying that there is a traditional Chinese curse, many of you would know what comes next. It's that saying you've heard, which may or may not be a traditional Chinese curse. May you live in interesting times. Our theme for the month is bright beginnings, and in another year on this night, we might be talking about the equinox and the lengthening of the light. We might delve into the metaphysical promise of the resurrected Christ. Or we might say with Ernest Holmes, seek the being of light within, follow it to the great light that is in everything. But we live in interesting times. In our Zoom meetings, I've been struck by how well our philosophy seems to be serving us and our ability to find joy and meaning, even in the midst of a shocking disruption, to adjust to a new normal, even as that new normal keeps shifting and changing under our feet, to focus on what is good and life-affirming in the midst of all the bad news that bombards us. And yet we live in interesting times. The numbers we're keeping track of this spring are not the latest baseball scores or the number of days until our summer vacation, but numbers that speak of heartbreak and death. How do we talk about light in a world that seems to be devolving into darkness, when the events that capture our attention are not bright beginnings, but tragic endings? And even our philosophy can't keep us from occasionally feeling despair. Certainly, our principles and our practices can help. We know intellectually that the goddess is all there is, that the goddess is all good, that the spirit that created everything is everywhere present, even in the midst of tragedy. There is nowhere where it is not. We know that all is in divine order. We know this intellectually and in what Howard Thurman would call the moments of our high resolve. We may even feel it in our bodies down to our bones. Holding that awareness, it's not something we just do for ourselves now to keep ourselves sane at a time like this, but something that we, as part of the one mind, do for everyone, to raise the consciousness of everyone, everywhere. But at this time, I think we're called to do more, and I think the more we are called to do is to recognize that these events, as inconvenient, anxiety-provoking, or tragic as they may seem, also present an opportunity. And it's not just an opportunity, but a calling, a demand that we respond to the external changes that we have imposed on us with equally profound internal changes. That we recognize that those external changes have, whether we like it or not, thrust us into a process of internal change. And we have a choice. We can try to resist and ignore it, or we can engage it mindfully and embrace it. Our philosophy supports us embracing it. It calls us to become more and more perfect reflections of that whole, perfect and complete version of ourselves that rests in the mind of God. And psychology tells us that when change happens, we resist or ignore it at our peril. Psychologists have a word for that unsettling combination of internal and external changes that we experience from time to time. It's called a transition. And by transition, they don't just mean change, although change is certainly the central theme. Instead, they refer to a process with a certain structure, with predictable phases, and with necessary tasks in each phase that need to be completed if a person's going to successfully navigate that transition. William Bridges, in his book Transition, states that adult life is an ongoing process of beginnings and endings, expansion and contraction. And this is how adults grow and change, by navigating the waters of change and turbulence, those rougher waters, and coming out a different person on the other side. Certainly each person here will have his or her own unique experience of and reaction to this worldwide event. But given how disruptive and how consequential it will probably prove for all of us, it's fair to say that each one of us has probably been thrust into some sort of major life transition. Luckily, psychology also offers guidance for negotiating those transition periods in a way that minimizes the disruption and maximizes the benefit. And that guidance fits nicely with what our tradition tells us to do. In a few minutes, we'll talk about the 3 different phases of the transition process and what we can do to navigate it more successfully. But first, in order to get a slightly different perspective on the transition process, I'm going to invite you to do a thought experiment with me. I'm going to invite you to go on a little journey, to actually go inside one traditional symbol of spring and new beginnings, the humble egg. Imagine with me for a minute that you are the little chick inside that egg. Here you are, folded up inside your eggshell, safe, protected. You get the urge to peck against the inside of the shell. Is it some primal urge that told you to do that, or you suddenly fed up with how cramped it is in there? Whatever the reason, you begin to peck and peck and peck. And suddenly something happens. There's a cracking noise, and although you have no words for it, there's a sense of having broken through somehow. You're probably disoriented. Everything seems pretty much the same, and yet something is different. You have no idea exactly what has changed or what it means, but you do know one thing. There, right before your eyes, is a beam of light that was not there before. For human beings, transitions often feel the same. Transitions have a beginning, a middle, and an end, but they begin with an ending and end with a beginning. Like the chick's loss of the integrity of its shell in that moment when the shell develops that first crack and it's really of no use anymore, the transition often begins with a loss or an ending that may or may not even be perceived at first. Often we mark the beginning by an event, a separation leading to a divorce, a job loss, a move across the country, retirement, a life-threatening illness, or something less tangible and more inwardly directed that we call a midlife crisis, or more recently, a quarter-life crisis, or a worldwide pandemic. Sometimes we choose the event that precipitates the transition. Sometimes it's chosen for us. That's phase one. Then there's phase two, what Bridges calls the neutral zone. Having experienced a few of these transitions myself, I can pretty much assure you that that period feels anything but neutral. It's a period of disorientation when the old order is gone and the new order has not emerged yet. And I'm imagining right now that every one of you can relate to that. The losses that accompanied that phase one, those endings, begin to show themselves and to be felt. Our emotions can seem volatile. The ground beneath us may seem to shift with disturbing regularity. And sometimes our very identity seems to be developing a few cracks of its own. Finally, in phase three, hints of a new beginning begin to emerge. Often those are as subtle as the first rays of dawn. And with the changes in the external circumstances, eventually there comes a recognition that we have, in some significant way, actually become a new person. How perfect it is for us at this time that while the CSL theme for the month is bright beginnings, all about light and newness, the CSL theme for this particular week is broken open. These experiences of transition are in fact the things that break us open, psychologically and spiritually, to let in the light. What I would like to do now is to have everyone just take a minute or so and go inward. Think about these questions. What are the most memorable transition events that you've experienced in your life? In particular, which one bubbles to the surface as one that changed you as a person? Was there one that left you feeling like you had somehow become more of who you were supposed to be? Let's just sit with that for a minute. And one more question. If you have in mind one of those transition periods that had changed you as a person in some fundamental way, when did you realize that you had been changed in a fundamental way? Was it during the transition period? Did you only realize it after the fact, maybe years later? When did that realization come to you? How did it come to you? So we're going to have a little longer discussion period in a little while, but for now, sorry. So now we're going to go over the 3 phases again and talk about some practical wisdom for each phase. What can we do in each of the phases to make it a little easier to face each one more fully? So let's talk about phase 1. As I mentioned before, all transitions have an ending. The major task in the first phase is to just recognize that something has happened. Not out there, in here, that change has come. And also to make the decision to accept it as a normal part of development, recognizing it and accepting it. Bridges invites us to look at the big picture. He quotes Arnold Toynbee, who wrote years ago on this, that societies gain access to new energies and new directions only after something happens. And what is that something? It's a time of troubles. A time of troubles initiates a process of disintegration. The old order has come apart, and often the new orientation becomes clear only after there's been a withdrawal and a return on the part of individuals or creative minorities within the society. That sounds a lot like what we are experiencing right now. What this tells us is that transitions are not to be resisted or ignored, but welcomed. What's true for societies is also true for individuals. Emerson wrote, not in their goals, but in their transitions, is a person great. And yet we are so reluctant to leave the familiar for the unknown. As Reverend Jeff reminded us on Sunday, no matter how much we want things to go back to normal, no matter how much we long for the familiar, once a transition has started, there is no going back. The Catholic theologian Richard Rohr offers this image. When God banished Adam and Eve from the garden, presumably from our perspective, not because they had sinned, but for their own growth and development, he made sure that they knew they could not return. He stationed angels at the gate with flaming swords. But Rohr also reminds us that it's when we have left behind the familiar, when we feel most out of control, that we develop faith. In his words, the opposite of faith is not doubt. The opposite of faith is control. I'm going to say that one again. The opposite of faith is not doubt. The opposite of faith is control. In the language of our tradition, the task of phase 1 is to accept that you have been broken open and to trust the influx of the light. So let's go to phase 2. Although it's called the neutral zone, the internal changes that it brings can be extremely uncomfortable. Some of you know that, thinking about the transitions you were thinking about earlier. In some transitions, it can feel like you are remodeling every room in your internal house while you try to live in it. The danger here is the temptation to act prematurely, just for the sake of acting, just to close down the process because it doesn't feel good and you don't like uncertainty. The main task of this phase is to understand that discomfort doesn't mean that something has gone wrong. The task is to allow this process of quiet inner transformation to unfold in its own time. There are tools that can help, and as I name some of them in a minute, perhaps you can check off in your own mind which ones you've incorporated into your stay-at-home toolbox and which ones you may want more of. It starts, I think, with creating temporary structures to see you through the process, routines, rituals that sustain and comfort you. Ramping up your self-care with sleep and exercise and meaningful connections with others. Acknowledging the losses you've experienced, the big ones and the small ones, and even the tiny ones. Allowing yourself time to pay attention to your internal process through time alone and journaling and meditation and prayer, gratitude practice. Becoming curious about your feelings, even the unpleasant ones, so that they can bring you messages from your deeper self. Allowing others to help, Remembering, for example, that our practitioners are available to pray with you. And finally, becoming curious about what Spirit might be calling you to do at this time. What do you feel called to do next? Because at times like this may be all we can know to do. And then ultimately, if there's going to be a new beginning, who is the person that Spirit is calling you to be? In primitive societies, when individuals go through these formal rites of passage, this phase is seen as a time of great importance. It's a time to contact spirit guides, to pay particular attention to dreams and intuition and synchronicities, those odd but meaningful coincidences that show up, and to embrace that which lies beyond ordinary reality. In the language of our tradition, the task of the second phase is to become the eye of the storm, to go within and be still, to notice that with the old normal out of the way, the veil has been lifted a bit, and there are glimpses of a deeper truth. So now we're in phase 3. In phase 3, the task is to pay attention to the emerging shape of a new beginning. Bridges notes that in phase 3, we long for external signs that point the way to the future. But unfortunately, we mostly have to settle for inner signals that alert us that there are new beginnings on the horizon. Those signals can be really, really subtle. It may amount to no more than realizing that we seem to be sort of resonating with one idea or another. And in our tradition, we are called upon not simply to pay attention, but to actively create the experiences we prefer and seek divine guidance in doing so. In his book, Life Visioning, Michael Beckworth describes our visioning practice as the spiritual technology that enables us to see the invisible and hear the inaudible, to intuitively catch the answers already burning in our consciousness. As religious scientists, our practices can not only keep us focused on the essential goodness of all it is, but remind us that we are engaged in a great, sacred, co-creative dance with Spirit that involves nothing less than life itself. Or as we were reminded at the CSL annual retreat last summer by a young ministerial student named Elisha Christopher, we are only secondarily a philosophy of positivity. We are primarily a philosophy of possibility. In the language of our tradition, the task in the third phase is to co-create the future. So where does that leave us? As a psychology intern, I once worked in a group home for severely emotionally disturbed adolescents. Many had suffered terrible abuse. In the first week, my new supervisor said to me, "If you come here and your heart is not breaking every day, you are not doing your job." We know that there are times when the only appropriate response is to be heartbroken. When you think your heart will break, remember the words of Andrew Harvey. If you're really listening, if you're awake to the poignant beauty of the world, your heart breaks regularly. In fact, your heart is made to burst open again and again, so that it can hold ever more wonders. We know that times of darkness often precede the light. We remember this Passover and Easter week, the experience of the master teacher Jesus, abandoned in the Garden of Gethsemane, suffering on the cross, crying, my God, why hast thou forsaken me?" When you feel the darkness encroaching, remember the words of Meister Eckhart. Truly it is in the darkness that one finds the light. We know that every beginning begins with an ending, but letting go is hard, so hard, especially in the face of massive uncertainty. When you're having trouble letting go of the past to embrace an uncertain future, remember the words of the Old Testament. Faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. These are the interesting times we live in. We are brokenhearted. We are broken open. We are in darkness. We are flooded with light. We are ending. We are beginning. In this time of enforced stillness, while the whole world holds its breath, when darkness encroaches, let us remember the words of T.S. Eliot. I said to my soul, be still and wait. So the darkness shall be the light, and the stillness the dancing.
Let us take a breath together and turn within and feel into the stillness that has been holding us every step of the way this evening. This internal presence is the one life and love that we call God, eternally whole, perfect, and complete, experiencing itself as all of creation and each person tuned in here tonight. I give thanks for this evening, for the technology and the technology wizards that have enabled us to be in community. I am grateful for the centering meditation and for the wisdom expressed in Alena's talk and the perspectives shared by others in the discussions. As we return to our separate lives, I affirm for each person an ever-deepening faith and trust in the one life and in ourselves within and as this one life. A faith and trust that enables us, especially in these interesting times, to wake up each morning in gratitude for whatever comes next. Ashe, Amen, and blessed be.
And blessed be. And don't forget, you can donate at the Oakland CSL webpage for your offering. We bless our tithes and offerings, our gifts that we receive. Some of the greatest gifts are appearing today at this Wednesday service. Thank you, ACS students. You're just the best. We're so blessed to have you. And that will conclude our Wednesday evening night service.
If people want to on their videos, they can take a few minutes and talk to each other.
Hello, bye-bye, Alena. Perfection. I had no doubt.
That was great, Alena. Loved it.
I agree.
Chica. Bye-bye.
Francione, thank you, Alena. That was marvelous and laid a good foundation for what next week I'm talking about. So.
Good. Very good.
Looking forward to seeing everybody next Wednesday. Ciao, chicos.
Bye. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, everyone.
And thank you for your beautiful prayer.
Yes.
Wonderful. Freya, perfection also.
Freya, great.
Diane. Alena, you were absolutely wonderful. This is Deborah.
I'm here, Deborah.
Great.
And Diane, you were fabulous as well.
Absolutely.
Everybody on this team is great.
Amazing.
Oh, thank you.
And how do I get the Google Doc?
Yeah, in chat.
There's a link.
Yeah.
Oh, I see it. If I hit it now, is that gonna? Oh.
You may have to cut and paste it.
Yeah, I think copy and paste is probably best, Reverend Francione.
Yeah.
Okay.
Copy and paste it.
To where?
Well,
Into your browser.
copy and paste it into your browser, and then it'll open you up to a document that's all the quotes. I just did it, and then I saved it to my desktop. It's really great to do it this way.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
And if you have trouble, you may be able to find me later, you know.
You may answer.
I may be around.
Thank you. Thank you.
Everybody.
It's so hard to say goodbye.
Here's what we do. We count to 3 and then I'm going to end the meeting.
Okay, 1,
1,
2,
Good night.
3. Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye.